How are social class divides and class power portrayed through the Marxist lens in La Haine and Parasite? When thinking of the concept of Marxism, founder Karl Marx's perception on social class divides is what generally is suggested on the topic. Marx's ideology essentially divides society into two different classes: the working class, or as referred to as Marx, the proletariats, and the higher class, the bourgeoisie. Marx believes that the ruling class or the bourgeoisie owns a means of production such as machines or tools that can be used to produce valuable objects. The working class or the proletariats only possess their own labor power, which they sell to the ruling class in the form of low-wage labor in order to survive, as stated by the sociological theories and global inequality. In La Haine, directed by Matthew Kassovitz, and Parasite, directed by Bong Joon-ho, we are introduced to two films which communicate the struggles between lower proletariat classes and the bourgeoisie, often through literal and symbolic differences which highlight the struggles and ostracization the proletariats face within their communities as they seek for a chance at class equality or better socioeconomic statuses. These films are reflective of the social and economical cultural context, specifically highlighting the economical classes in the capitalist society and a Marxist critique on these capitalist systems for portraying the social struggles of individuals in the film. This aspect is representative of the proletariats one day spontaneously developing the class consciousness needed to rise up in violent revolution against their oppressors and create a classless society. As stated by critical theory today, the first film element used is cinematography, particularly looking at shot types and angles. In Parasite, John Woo depicts the difference in social classes through the use of angles, which create visual lines in the shot. This line is seen in many shots in the film and represents a dichotomy between both classes, particularly expressing the inability for the Kims, the proletariats in the sense of this film, to integrate themselves into the bourgeoisies, the Parks. This communicates the nature of social hierarchy, and although the Kims may fool the Parks in believing their social status in their society, the hierarchy will always reveal its true nature in the division between both classes. This is reflective of Marx's theories and its basis on our society today, where the introduction to film theory states, "For the real battle lines are drawn, to put matter simply, between the haves and the have-nots, between the bourgeoisie, those who control the world's natural, economic, and human resources, and the proletariats, the majority of the global population, who live in substandard conditions and who have always performed the manual labor." Therefore, this line can be visualized in the way social classes have been separated by standardized beliefs of our social hierarchy, and where each individual fits in that hierarchy. The Kims never crossing that line can foreshadow how the lower social classes will never get to transform themselves into the higher social classes, implementing their socio-economic division. With La Haine, at the time of the film's productions, minorities in France were segregated into the banlieues of Paris, also known as the suburbs. This setting is also symbolic of their economical status in the hierarchy. Thus, the use of extreme long shots when filming Vince and his friends reveals a lack of government attention towards the minorities in France and their issues, prioritizing their issues as very insignificant in comparison to the high-class individuals who live in Paris. The extreme long shots insinuate their small place within the social hierarchy, which reflects their social status within France. Where in contrast, the Paris setting pictures the high-class individuals using medium shots with lack of negative space, creating a claustrophobic shot which can emphasize their inclusion in their society. This idea of being a lot smaller for the proletariat also employs the concept of how the low class has been ostracized from the larger community. This ostracization often leads to revolting against the hierarchy as they seek socio-economic justice. This revolution is reflective of Marxism, where proletariats who undergo inequality and exploitation will lead to a revolution in which the working class rebels against the bourgeoisie, takes control of the means of production, and abolishes capitalism, as stated by Investopedia. This revolt against the bourgeoisie can be illustrated when Vince rebels against unjustified action of the police and the political ideology which isolate minorities and migrants away from Paris. Furthermore, both films communicate the renowned ideology of the American dream using mise en scène. Marxists aim to expose the American dream as not a natural way of life, but simply one of many ideologies or ways of looking at the world, one that they believe falsely presupposes that the pursuit of wealth is an inherently good and meaningful pursuit. As stated by Introduction to Film Theory, The association of Western hip hop music in Latin, such as the references to the song Sound of That Police, is influenced by the idea of the American dream and the implementation of the westernized hood setting into the banlieue in France. The outfits they wear also resemble the hip hop street style. Hip hop clothing and music style represents the conditions of living in the hood and the racial injustice they endure. This represents how they identify themselves within the lower class demographic and portrays the social issues and how they also suffer from the racial segregation in France as they are forced to live in the lower class banlieue, which is often referred to as the hoodlum of Paris. This revolves around the concept of the American dream, as they choose to implement westernized style within their lifestyles in hopes of affiliating themselves with the Western high-class community, as they envision the Western culture as more bourgeoisie. This is reflective of the common view of non-US citizens on the economical and social opportunities the US provides for them. Whereas in Parasite, John Woo represents this idea of the American dream by implementing contrasting set designs for the Kim and the Park's family. The idea that the Kims live in the basement, basically underground, whilst the Park literally live on an elevated plane, can emphasize the contrast in social classes. This contrast and the concept of the American dream can be illustrated in the film with the Kims' desperation of attending this high point of wealth and status which the American dream conveys, essentially living underground to infiltrating themselves in the Park's house on that elevated plane. That journey from the bottom to the top is symbolic to the presupposed vision of the American dream and how individuals, according to Investopedia, regardless of where they are born or what class they were born into, one can attain their own version of success in a society in which upward mobility is possible for everyone. Thus, this idea of upward mobility can be seen as they infiltrate the Park's family and essentially become occupants of the house, this concept being their own version of the American dream. However, the Marxist vision of the American dream is that chasing wealth will often expose the individuals to a false sense of social belonging in the bourgeoisie. This can be illustrated by the extent the Kim's family will go to infiltrate the family, in addition to committing violent acts. Therefore, this sense of social belonging in the higher class trails back to the concept of the failed American dream. In addition, the symbols presented in both films can represent character motivations regarding their desires for socio-economic justice. In La Haine, the symbol of the gun Vince finds from the police ignites his sense of power above them, and thus provokes his character motivations to use this symbol to retain the power he does not have. The gun enacts as an archway towards achieving this sense of power over the individuals who have alienated him, which include the police and the bourgeoisie. This represents the Marxist aspect that, when people have become aware of their loss of their alienation as a universal non-human situation, it will be possible for them to proceed to a radical transformation of their situation by a revolution. As stated by Britannica. Thus explains Vin's motivations for using the gun for violent reasons after being subjugated to injustice by the police due to his lower class status. In Parasite, the rock Kiwoo received from his successful friend is representative of this desperation towards implementing himself in the higher class communities. Both these films portray how these symbols provide them with hope and power regarding their place in their society. However, the films also show how these symbols have turned onto them, and in the end of La Haine, Vince is shot, and Hubert uses this gun to try and retribute for his loss, leading to what is only interpreted as his own death. Whilst in Parasite, the same rock that was going to provide them prosperity and wealth nearly killed Kiwoo as he was being hit by it with the housekeeper's husband. What begins as hope and a motive for change within their current living and social classes conditions ends up bashing them down quite literally in the sense of both films, insinuating how they were guided by these false illusions of hope from these symbols. This reveals the difficulties of lower classes trying to integrate themselves in the higher class societies due to their social differences being extremely pronounced within society itself. To conclude, both these films utilize cinematography, mise-en-scène, and symbols to portray how the proletates are oftentimes unable to rise above the socio-economic boundaries of their class, no matter how hard they try to integrate themselves. This reveals the difficulties of proliterates freeing themselves from capitalist oppression, and also portrays the division between classes and how their lifestyles are impacted socially due to the lack of an economic equality.